My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 62 years old, and 6 months ago I sat alone in a catering kitchen, eating cold chicken beside a stack of dirty champagne glasses while strangers celebrated my son's wedding 30 feet away. Through the swinging service doors, I could hear laughter, music, and crystal glasses clinking beneath expensive vineyard lights. My son Daniel was dancing with his bride, while guests toasted the future of two distinguished families. That phrase mattered greatly to the people hosting the wedding. Distinguished families. Old money families. Families who owned boats with names painted on the side in vacation homes. They visited only 3 weeks a year. Families unlike mine, at least that's what they believed. I remember staring down at the paper plate in my lap while one of the catering girls whispered, "Mom, are you all right?" I told her I was fine, because women from my generation say they're fine long after something inside them has started bleeding quietly. But the truth is, I had never felt humiliation settle so deeply into my bones before that night. Not when my husband died unexpectedly at 48. Not when debt collectors called our farmhouse every morning after the recession nearly destroyed us. Not even when I worked double shifts cleaning motel rooms outside Hannibal, Missouri, just to keep Daniel in community college after his father passed. None of that hurt the way this hurt, because grief is easier to survive than being treated like someone your own child should feel embarrassed by. But here is the part none of those people inside the ballroom understood while they smiled politely and pushed me toward the kitchen entrance like unwanted furniture. The vineyard hosting that wedding, the beautiful 60-acre property covered in white lanterns and imported roses, legally belonged to me. And before the night ended, the family lawyer was going to say my name in front of every single guest at that wedding reception. If you've ever been judged by people who measured human worth through money instead of sacrifice, this story is for you. And if you're new here, welcome to She Finally Spoke, where quiet people finally stop swallowing disrespect just to keep others comfortable. I grew up outside Monroe City, Missouri, in a farmhouse with peeling paint and a porch swing my father repaired every spring whether it needed fixing or not. My mother worked at a diner off Highway 24, and my father repaired irrigation equipment for local farms until arthritis twisted his hands too badly to hold tools properly. We never had much money, but my parents treated dignity like a form of wealth nobody could repossess. My father used to say, "Poor is temporary, mean is permanent." It took me most of my life to understand how right he was. I married Thomas Carter in 1983 when I was 20 years old. Tom was tall, quiet, and carried sadness in his face even before life gave him reasons for it. He came from an old farming family near St. Charles County that once owned hundreds of acres of vineyard land before his grandfather lost most of it during bad investments in the 70s. By the time I met him, the Carter family had already split into two very different branches. One side rebuilt their wealth through wine distribution and commercial property investments. The other side, Tom's side, kept only a small farmhouse and enough pride to pretend the separation didn't hurt. Tom never liked talking about his wealthier relatives, especially his cousin Arthur Beaumont, who eventually turned the remaining family vineyard into one of the most exclusive wedding destinations in Missouri wine country. Beaumont Ridge Vineyard became the kind of place magazines described using words like elegant rustic luxury, string lights, imported stone fountains, $5,000 wedding packages, rich people drinking expensive wine while pretending barns were charming. Tom used to joke bitterly, "They sell fake country life to people who've never struggled a day in their lives." Still, he loved the land itself. Every October we drove through St. Charles County just to watch the vineyards turn gold and crimson beneath the autumn hills. Daniel sat in the back seat as a little boy, counting rows of grapevines while Tom pointed toward distant fields explaining which parcels used to belong to his grandfather decades earlier. Men carry strange grief about land, especially when it once belonged to their family. Daniel was born during an ice storm in February of 1988, after 14 hours of labor and one terrifying moment where doctors briefly lost his heartbeat completely. When they finally placed him in my arms, Tom cried harder than I did. Daniel grew into the kindest child I'd ever known. Sensitive, intelligent, the sort of boy who apologized to furniture after bumping into it accidentally. He loved books, old blues music, and fixing broken things with his father in the garage workshop behind our house. Then Tom died 3 weeks before Daniel's 19th birthday. Massive heart attack while repairing a tractor engine outside a neighbor's barn. 1 minute alive. 20 minutes later gone forever beneath fluorescent emergency room lights. Everything after that became survival. Widowhood at 49 is not romantic the way old movies pretend it is. Nobody talks honestly about the paperwork, the loneliness, The way household silence changes shape permanently after someone dies. I worked wherever I could find hours: motel housekeeping, grocery stocking, school cafeteria shifts. Eventually, I cleaned lake cabins during tourist season near Mark Twain Lake, because wealthy vacationers tipped well when they avoided eye contact long enough. Daniel tried helping immediately after the funeral. He took construction jobs during college breaks and constantly worried about money even when I begged him not to. "Mom," he said once while repairing our porch steps at 21 years old, "I hate watching you work this hard." I remember touching his cheek and telling him something my own mother told me years earlier. Love that survives hard times is never wasted. For a long time, it was just the two of us against the world. Then Daniel met Vanessa Beaumont. He was 27 by then, working as a junior architect for a development company in St. Louis. Vanessa came from old Missouri money wrapped in polished manners and expensive education. Her father, Charles Beaumont, owned several luxury hospitality properties connected to wine tourism throughout the state. Her mother, Patricia Beaumont, chaired charity galas and treated social reputation like a competitive sport. The first time Daniel mentioned Vanessa over the phone, I heard happiness in his voice immediately. Real happiness. The kind parents pray their children eventually find. "She's different, Mom," he told me one Sunday evening. "She actually listens when people talk." I wanted to love her instantly because my son already did. And truthfully, at first, Vanessa seemed lovely. She sent handwritten thank you cards after meeting me, asked thoughtful questions about Tom during family dinners, hugged me goodbye instead of offering polite, distant smiles, the way wealthy people sometimes do when they're trying not to wrinkle expensive clothing. But Patricia Beaumont noticed me differently from the beginning. Women like Patricia always do. She observed everything quietly during our first dinner together at a steakhouse in Clayton. My department store dress, my careful pronunciation around wine lists I didn't fully understand. The fact my handbag straps were beginning to crack near the stitching because I'd owned the same purse for almost 8 years. Patricia smiled constantly during that dinner. Warm smile. Perfect smile. The kind practiced in mirrors before charity events. "Daniel says you worked incredibly hard after your husband passed," she said while cutting filet mignon delicately into tiny perfect bites. "I did what needed doing," I answered. "Of course." Patricia sipped wine slowly. "Resilience is admirable, admire. Interesting word. People use it when they want to compliment suffering from a safe emotional distance." Charles Beaumont barely spoke throughout dinner except to discuss investment properties and vineyard expansion plans with Daniel. Rich men often treat conversations like presentations where everyone else simply waits politely for pauses. The evening remained civil enough on the surface, but driving home afterward I felt strangely exhausted. Not because anyone openly insulted me, because subtle judgment requires energy to survive. Wealthy people who pride themselves on manners rarely humiliate you directly. They simply make comfort feel conditional. Over the next year, Daniel and Vanessa became serious quickly. Engagement rumors started circulating long before he officially proposed during a winter weekend in Aspen, with both families present. Both families. I still remember laughing quietly when Daniel first told me that part. My family had never vacationed anywhere requiring ski equipment. The wedding planning started almost immediately afterward, and that was when Patricia Beaumont's politeness finally began slipping enough for me to see the truth underneath it. "Vanessa deserves something timeless," Patricia announced during our first planning lunch at Beaumont Ridge Vineyard. She spoke about the wedding the way museum curators discuss expensive art acquisitions. "Our family has hosted events here for generations." Our family. Interesting phrase considering half the vineyard land originally belonged to Tom's side before financial desperation forced quiet legal arrangements decades earlier. I sat silently through most of that lunch while Patricia discussed imported flowers, guest lists, wine pairings, and social columns expected to cover the event. Vanessa looked increasingly overwhelmed beside her mother, while Daniel kept squeezing my hand beneath the table whenever Patricia's comments drifted too close to condescension. Then Patricia smiled toward me gently and said the sentence that changed everything. "I know these kinds of events can feel intimidating if you're not accustomed to them." The table went completely silent. Daniel's hand tightened around mine immediately. And for the first time since meeting the Beaumont family, I realized something cold and ugly. Patricia Beaumont did not merely think she was better than me. She believed my son had married upward by escaping women like me entirely. The strange thing about humiliation is that it often arrives smiling. Patricia Beaumont never raised her voice, never openly insulted me in front of Daniel or Vanessa. Women like Patricia considered obvious cruelty beneath them. Instead, she specialized in tiny, elegant cuts delivered so politely you almost questioned whether they happened at all. That was her talent, making exclusion feel sophisticated. After the vineyard lunch, the wedding planning became less about celebrating Daniel and Vanessa, and more about staging a social performance for people Patricia desperately wanted to impress. Every conversation revolved around guest prestige, political donors, wine investors, old St. Louis families, and magazine photographers. Patricia somehow convinced herself cared deeply about table linens. I tried staying out of the way. That's what women from my generation do when wealthier people make discomfort obvious. We minimize ourselves to preserve peace. We volunteer silence because silence feels safer than becoming someone else's embarrassment. But Daniel noticed more than Patricia realized. 3 weeks after the vineyard meeting, he drove down to Monroe City to help repair storm damage on my back porch after heavy spring winds tore loose half the railing. We spent the afternoon replacing warped boards, while country radio played softly from his truck nearby. Around sunset, Daniel finally put his hammer down and asked quietly, "Mom, has Patricia been rude to you?" I looked over at my son standing there in dusty work jeans exactly like his father used to wear, and suddenly I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "She's protective of Vanessa," I answered carefully. Daniel frowned immediately. "That's not what I asked." I smiled faintly because children eventually learn the emotional language their parents spent years trying to hide from them. Daniel inherited Tom's ability to hear truth hiding beneath softer words. "She just comes from a different world," I admitted. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, frustration visible across his face. "Sometimes I think her mother treats people like social rankings instead of human beings." I said nothing because once adult children begin recognizing class cruelty for themselves, parents should let them arrive there honestly. The truth was, Patricia's behavior had already escalated beyond subtle comments by then. 2 weeks earlier, she invited me to a bridal charity luncheon in St. Louis, where every woman attending seemed professionally trained in the art of appearing expensive. I wore a navy dress from Macy's and spent 40 minutes curling my hair beforehand, because part of me still believed effort might bridge worlds money created. Patricia greeted me warmly at the entrance before immediately introducing me to 3 women as Daniel's sweet mother from Monroe County. From Monroe County, not Evelyn, not Daniel's mother, certainly not part of their world. The women smiled politely after that introduction the same way people smile at exchange students they don't expect to see again. One asked whether I enjoyed small-town living. Another seemed deeply fascinated that I once cleaned motel rooms after Tom died, as though financial struggle were a historical reenactment rather than real life. I survived the luncheon, smiling so hard my cheeks physically hurt afterward. That night I sat alone at my kitchen table eating tomato soup from a chipped bowl, while staring at an old photograph of Tom taped beside the refrigerator. In the picture, he stood inside his father's old vineyard field, sometime around 1985, holding toddler Daniel against his shoulder while autumn leaves turned gold behind them. I remember touching the photograph gently and whispering, "You would hate these people," and honestly, part of me hated myself for caring so much, because Patricia Beaumont wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. I did feel intimidated, not by wealth itself. Wealth never impressed me much after watching how quickly life can take people away forever, but by the possibility that Daniel might eventually feel ashamed of where he came from once enough wealthy people repeated the idea politely around him. That fear settled deep inside me quietly. The wedding plans intensified through summer. Vanessa seemed increasingly stressed, trying to balance genuine love for Daniel with the impossible expectations orbiting her mother constantly. More than once, I caught her apologizing for Patricia's comments indirectly. "She means well," Vanessa whispered after one particularly uncomfortable cake tasting, where Patricia informed the bakery staff my side of the guest list would probably prefer simpler dessert options. I remember looking at Vanessa carefully then. Sweet girl. Good heart. But girls raised around privilege often mistake cruelty for personality, because they've never lived long enough without power to recognize the difference clearly. Meanwhile, Patricia transformed Beaumont Ridge Vineyard into a performance stage disguised as a wedding venue. Construction crews installed temporary garden arches imported from Nashville. Florists arrived weekly. One planner described the event theme as elevated American heritage elegance, which sounded like expensive nonsense to me. Still, Daniel looked happy whenever he talked about marrying Vanessa. That mattered more than my pride. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Then came the rehearsal dinner. The dinner took place inside the vineyard's private stone reception hall, overlooking acres of glowing vineyard rows beneath sunset. Crystal chandeliers hung from wooden beams, while white linen tables stretched across polished hardwood floors. Everything smelled faintly of roses and expensive wine. A string quartet played near the fireplace, because apparently rich people cannot consume chicken parmesan without live classical accompaniment. I arrived 20 minutes early wearing a dark green dress Emily Parker from church helped me pick out, because she insisted the color made my eyes look younger. I even paid to have my hair professionally styled for the first time since Daniel's college graduation. Silly now thinking back on it. The effort women make hoping respect might become easier if they simply appear polished enough. Vanessa hugged me warmly when I entered. "You look beautiful," she said sincerely. Then Patricia walked over. She wore cream silk and diamonds subtle enough to cost more than my car. Patricia scanned me quickly with the same expression real estate agents use evaluating starter homes. "Oh, good," she said pleasantly. "You found something appropriate." Daniel heard it too this time. I saw his face change immediately. "Mom," he said sharply toward Patricia, but Patricia only smiled and adjusted one of the floral centerpieces. "What? She does look lovely." That was the danger of Patricia Beaumont. Every insult arrived, wrapped carefully enough to create plausible innocence afterward. Dinner itself became an exhausting parade of speeches from vineyard investors, country club friends, and distant Beaumont relatives who discussed Daniel like an unexpectedly successful scholarship student, admitted into better circles through determination and charm. One older man actually clapped Daniel on the shoulder and said, "Your mother must be thrilled seeing how far you've come." As though I came from somewhere beneath him. As though Daniel escaped me instead of being raised by me. I drank water and smiled until my jaw hurt. Then, halfway through dessert, Patricia stood near the head table tapping a champagne glass for attention. "I just want to thank everyone who helped make tomorrow possible," she announced elegantly. "Especially the Beaumont family team here at the vineyard who worked tirelessly behind the scenes." Polite applause filled the hall, then Patricia's eyes landed on me. "And of course," she added with that same beautiful poisonous smile, "we're grateful Evelyn could join us despite feeling a bit overwhelmed by events at this scale." The room laughed softly. That somehow made it worse. Daniel immediately pushed his chair back. "Enough," he said loudly. The entire room fell silent. Patricia blinked, stunned. "Excuse me? You keep talking about my mother like she's some charity guest you invited for decoration." Several people looked down at their plates instantly. Vanessa whispered, "Daniel." "No," he continued, anger finally breaking through years of politeness. "She raised me alone after my father died. She worked herself sick so I could finish school. And I'm tired of people acting like she should feel grateful just to sit in this room." Patricia's expression hardened immediately beneath controlled social elegance. "You're overreacting." "There it is," Daniel laughed bitterly. "That's what rich people always say after insulting someone successfully." The silence afterward felt enormous. Charles Beaumont finally stood from the table, clearly embarrassed by public conflict. "Let's calm down." But Patricia was already angry now. Truly angry. Because public image mattered more to her than kindness ever would. "I have done nothing but welcome this family," she said coldly. Daniel looked directly at her. "No, you welcomed me. You tolerated my mother." That sentence landed like broken glass across the room. Patricia stared at Daniel for several seconds before replying quietly, "I think perhaps your mother has influenced your emotions tonight." "My emotions? Interesting how women become responsible for discomfort men finally choose to voice themselves." I opened my mouth to calm things down because decades of survival trained me to end conflict even when it wounded me personally. But before I could speak, Charles Beaumont interrupted suddenly. "Tomorrow is the wedding," he said firmly. "No more scenes." Scenes. As though my existence inside their world created disruption automatically. The evening ended awkwardly after that. Guests avoided eye contact while pretending conversations remained normal. Vanessa cried quietly near the hallway while Daniel apologized to me repeatedly outside beneath vineyard lights. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should stop this sooner." I touched his face gently and told him the truth. "This isn't your shame to carry." But driving back to my motel that night, I realized something painful. Patricia Beaumont truly believed she had already won. She believed wealth gave her authority to decide who belonged comfortably inside that vineyard, and who should remain quietly grateful near the edges. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 hours earlier, before rehearsal dinner even started, An elderly attorney named Harold Whitmore arrived at Beaumont Ridge, carrying documents connected to Tom's grandfather's original land agreement. And by tomorrow evening, Patricia Beaumont was going to learn exactly whose family she spent the last year humiliating publicly. I barely slept the night before the wedding. The motel room smelled faintly of old coffee and laundry detergent, while trucks moved steadily along the highway outside my window. But none of that kept me awake as much as my own thoughts did. Humiliation has a strange way of replaying itself after midnight. Patricia's smile during rehearsal dinner, the laughter after her comment, Daniel standing in front of wealthy strangers, defending me with anger sharp enough to crack his voice. Parents spend years trying to protect children from pain, but nobody prepares you for the guilt of watching your child inherit your humiliation publicly. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up on sleep entirely and sat beside the motel window, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee while staring at rain moving softly across the parking lot. That was when my phone rang. The number belonged to Harold Whitmore. I almost didn't answer because it was so early, but something in my chest tightened the second I saw his name. Harold Whitmore had been the Carter family attorney for over 40 years. He was 81 years old now, with thinning white hair and a voice that always sounded slightly distracted, as though part of his mind remained buried inside old legal archives permanently. I met him only a handful of times over the years, mostly during Tom's father's funeral and later after Tom died unexpectedly. Harold rarely called people casually. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently after I answered. "I apologize for the hour." "It's all right," I told him quietly. I wasn't sleeping anyway. A long silence followed before he spoke again. "I reviewed the original land agreements last night after our conversation yesterday afternoon." My stomach tightened immediately. "And?" Harold cleared his throat softly. "Your husband never explained everything to you before he passed, did he?" That question lingered heavily between us, because suddenly I understood there were pieces of Tom's family history I never fully knew. The previous afternoon, shortly before rehearsal dinner began, Harold approached me privately near the vineyard entrance while staff arranged flower installations around the ceremony lawn. I had not seen him in nearly 8 years, but he recognized me immediately. "Evelyn," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "You look remarkably like June these days." Hearing my mother's name nearly made me emotional on the spot because older people carry memory differently. They speak names long after the rest of the world quietly stops saying them aloud. Harold asked whether we could talk privately for a moment. We sat together beneath a covered stone patio overlooking vineyard rows turning gold beneath late afternoon sunlight. That was when he mentioned Tom's grandfather's original property agreement connected to Beaumont Ridge. Apparently decades earlier, before financial losses forced most of the Carter land sales, Tom's grandfather negotiated one unusual condition during the transfer of remaining vineyard acreage to the Beaumont side of the family. Harold explained that because the Carter family desperately needed money during the recession years, the Beaumont branch acquired majority operational control of the property. However, ownership rights tied to specific sections of the original estate remained legally connected through inheritance clauses buried inside the trust structure. At the time, I barely understood half the legal terminology. I certainly understood it now. "Harold," I whispered into the motel phone, "what exactly are you telling me?" He exhaled slowly before answering. "I'm telling you Beaumont Ridge Vineyard technically sits on jointly inherited Carter land protections your husband retained until his death. And according to the amended inheritance structure filed after Thomas passed away, those rights transferred directly to you." I closed my eyes immediately. "What kind of rights? Operational ownership percentages tied to event usage licensing?" I sat perfectly still trying to process the words. "I don't understand." "You legally own 30% of the vineyard ceremonial event property," Harold said carefully, "including wedding usage authorization for the south reception grounds where today's ceremony is taking place." Silence swallowed the motel room completely. Outside, rain drifted against the parking lot beneath pale dawn light while my entire understanding of the Beaumont family shifted underneath me. "Why didn't Tom tell me this?" I asked quietly. Harold hesitated. "Because Thomas hated the Beaumont side of the family near the end. He believed discussing the vineyard only reopened old wounds after his grandfather died. But when his health insurance situation worsened during Daniel's college years, we updated several inheritance protections connected to remaining Carter assets. Your husband insisted the vineyard rights transfer directly to you if anything happened to him." My throat tightened painfully. Tom knew. Not about Patricia specifically, obviously. But he knew enough about wealth, power, and humiliation inside his own family to quietly protect me long before he died. "Does Patricia know?" I finally asked. Harold actually laughed softly. "Patricia Beaumont barely reads contracts shorter than charity invitations. Charles probably knows portions of the arrangement exist, but I strongly doubt either of them remembers how much authority transferred after Thomas passed." I looked down at my trembling hands. "What happens now?" "That," Harold said gently, "depends entirely on you." After hanging up, I sat beside the motel window until sunrise, remembering conversations Tom and I shared years earlier that suddenly sounded different in hindsight. The way he always insisted my name remain connected to every financial account, no matter how little money we actually had. The way he distrusted Arthur Beaumont's branch of the family, even during polite holiday gatherings. The way he once told Daniel, "Never let rich people convince you they invented dignity." At 8:30 that morning, I drove toward Beaumont Ridge Vineyard beneath cloudy skies, while local radio stations discussed weather forecasts and college football. Recruiting news like the world remained perfectly ordinary, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Not after discovering the family humiliating me publicly had spent decades benefiting from legal agreements tied directly to my husband's bloodline. The vineyard looked breathtaking when I arrived. White floral arrangements lined stone walkways while staff rushed between reception tents carrying trays of champagne glasses and folded linens. Guests in expensive clothing drifted across the property, laughing beneath gray autumn skies. The entire place smelled faintly of fresh roses and wet grass, and every inch of it suddenly felt different to me. Not because I wanted revenge exactly, because for the first time since meeting Patricia Beaumont, I understood something important. I did belong there. A young wedding coordinator approached immediately with a nervous smile. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked. "Patricia wanted me to let you know family seating arrangements changed slightly this morning." Of course they did. Patricia never stopped adjusting social optics once discomfort entered the picture. The coordinator explained carefully that due to guest balancing logistics, my table assignment for the reception moved near the rear service entrance, beside several extended relatives from Tom's side, Patricia considered less socially valuable. I listened quietly while she avoided direct eye contact from embarrassment. Poor girl probably hated delivering messages like this. "That's fine," I answered softly. And strangely enough, I meant it. Because humiliation only works when you still believe the people humiliating you deserve authority over your self-worth. Inside the bridal suite, Vanessa hugged me immediately after I arrived. Her eyes looked swollen from crying. "I'm so sorry about last night," she whispered. Mom crossed a line. I touched her hand gently. "Today is your wedding day. Don't spend it apologizing for other people's choices." Vanessa looked relieved enough to cry again after that. Sweet girl. Trapped between loyalty and fear, then Patricia entered the room. She wore pale silver silk with diamonds at her throat and the expression of a woman determined to regain social control after public embarrassment. "Evelyn," she said smoothly, "I'm glad you came. As though attendance itself remained uncertain after the previous evening, I smiled politely. Of course, Daniel's wedding matters more than discomfort. Something flickered briefly across Patricia's face at that sentence. Maybe guilt. Maybe annoyance that I refused to behave emotionally enough for her to dismiss me comfortably. The ceremony itself passed beautifully despite everything. Daniel looked at Vanessa like she hung the moon itself above those vineyards, and Vanessa truly loved him. That part never changed. Watching my son cry quietly during his vows nearly broke my heart because love remained real even inside all the ugliness surrounding it. For 2 hours afterward, I almost convinced myself I could survive the reception peacefully too. Then Patricia approached me near the ballroom entrance just as guests prepared for dinner service. "Evelyn," she said with perfect social warmth, "we've had an unexpected seating issue with several wine investors arriving late." "Here it comes," I thought immediately. "I was wondering if you'd mind eating temporarily in the catering lounge while we reorganize the front tables." The catering lounge, not even the reception hall, the kitchen. I stared at her for several seconds while music drifted softly through ballroom doors nearby. Patricia smiled the entire time, waiting for compliance, waiting for gratitude, waiting for the poor widow to make herself small quietly one more time. And because I still loved my son more than my pride in that moment, I nodded once and followed the young catering assistant through the service hallway toward the back kitchen. What Patricia Beaumont didn't realize while seating me beside industrial refrigerators and dirty champagne trays was that Harold Whitmore had already arrived, carrying legal documents in a leather briefcase with my name written across the front. And within the hour, The wedding reception she spent 12 months controlling was about to become mine publicly. The catering kitchen sat behind the ballroom, separated by two heavy swinging doors and an entire social class. One side held chandeliers, live jazz music, and people discussing Napa wine investments beneath soft golden lighting. The other side smelled like industrial dish soap, roasted chicken, and exhaustion. Stainless steel counters lined the walls while overwhelmed catering staff rushed between ovens carrying trays of salmon and champagne buckets. Nobody inside that kitchen treated me cruelly. In fact, the young staff members looked uncomfortable the moment they realized where I had been seated. One older waitress, with tired eyes and aching knees, set a paper napkin beside my plate and whispered quietly, "People can be awful when money gets involved." I smiled faintly because she understood something Patricia Beaumont never would. Working people recognize humiliation immediately because most of us have survived some version of it ourselves. I sat alone near a stack of folded banquet chairs, listening to muffled applause drifting through the ballroom walls every few minutes. Toasts had started. Daniel was probably smiling politely while wealthy strangers congratulated the merging of two respected families. I wondered whether he knew where Patricia placed me. Part of me suspected he didn't. Patricia preferred cruelty that remained deniable later. If Daniel confronted her publicly again, she could simply claim temporary logistics problems and act wounded by misunderstanding. A young catering assistant eventually brought me a plate containing cold rosemary chicken and roasted potatoes that had clearly been sitting too long beneath warming lights. I thanked her sincerely anyway, because dignity should never depend on circumstance. Halfway through the meal, the swinging kitchen doors opened suddenly, and Daniel walked inside, still wearing his tuxedo jacket partially unbuttoned. The second he saw me sitting there alone, his face changed completely. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you doing back here?" I looked up at my son standing beneath fluorescent kitchen lights, while ballroom music echoed faintly behind him. 28 years old, handsome like his father, heart too soft for the world sometimes. I almost lied to protect him emotionally the way mothers often do instinctively, but protecting children from truth too long only leaves them vulnerable to manipulative people later. "Your mother-in-law moved my table," I answered calmly. Daniel stared at me for several seconds before understanding fully arrived across his face. "She put you in the kitchen?" I nodded once. Anger spread through him so visibly it startled even the catering staff nearby. "You have got to be kidding me." He turned immediately toward the ballroom doors, but I reached out gently and grabbed his wrist before he could leave. "Daniel," he stopped. "Not tonight." His eyes filled with hurt frustration instantly. "Mom, she humiliated you." I smiled sadly. "Your wedding matters more." "No," he said sharply. "No, it doesn't. Not if this is what people I love are treated like." That sentence nearly made me cry right there beside industrial refrigerators and dirty serving trays. I squeezed his hand gently. "Listen to me carefully. The only thing I want tonight is for you to remember why you married Vanessa in the first place. Don't let Patricia turn your wedding into another performance about power." Daniel looked torn apart internally, angry son, loyal husband, exhausted man trapped between them both. Finally, he sat beside me at the folding table and lowered his voice. "I'm starting to think I don't recognize these people anymore." I looked at him carefully then. "You recognize them perfectly. You're just finally seeing them clearly." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Kitchen staff moved around us quietly, pretending not to overhear family heartbreak. Then Daniel surprised me by laughing softly under his breath. "Dad would hate this place." I smiled immediately because he was right. Tom Wood despised every polished fake interaction happening inside that ballroom. "Your father once said, 'Rich people spend thousands recreating the country life ordinary people are desperate to escape.'" Daniel laughed harder after that. Real laughter this time. The kind grief leaves behind unexpectedly years after someone dies. Then Harold Whitmore entered the kitchen. At 81 years old, Harold moved slowly now, but there remained something deeply steady about him. He carried a worn leather briefcase beneath one arm while scanning the kitchen until his eyes landed on me. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I hoped I'd find you before dinner service ended." Daniel stood immediately, shaking Harold's hand politely. "Mr. Whitmore." Harold smiled gently toward him. "You look exactly like your grandfather tonight." Daniel thanked him quietly before excusing himself back toward the ballroom after kissing my forehead softly. "I'm sorry," he whispered before leaving. I touched his cheek. "None of this is your fault." The moment Daniel disappeared through the kitchen doors, Harold sat beside me and carefully opened his briefcase. Inside rested several legal folders thick with documents and property records. My stomach tightened instantly. Charles Beaumont approached me earlier this afternoon, Harold explained quietly while adjusting his glasses. Apparently, the Vineyard Board intends to restructure several event licensing contracts next quarter. I frowned slightly. What does that have to do with me? Harold looked directly at me then. Everything. He removed one document and slid it carefully across the table. Because they legally cannot proceed without your authorization. I stared down at the paperwork while fluorescent kitchen lights reflected softly across polished steel counters nearby. My name appeared clearly across the ownership section, beneath formal legal language, connected to Beaumont Ridge Vineyard South Ceremonial Grounds. Evelyn Carter, not Evelyn Beaumont Guest, not Daniel's small-town mother-owner. Even now the word feels strange in my head. Harold continued speaking gently. Your late husband's grandfather protected minority family rights through inheritance contingencies after the original land consolidation decades ago. Most of the Beaumont side forgot those agreements existed because operational control remained with Arthur Beaumont's branch. But legally, ceremonial licensing authority tied to the Southern event property transferred through Thomas after his death. I looked up slowly. So Patricia, Harold smiled faintly. Patricia Beaumont seated a legal property owner beside dirty dishes while charging guests $40,000 to attend a wedding on your land. For the first time all evening, genuine amusement touched me, not revenge exactly. Perspective because humiliation changes shape once truth enters the room. I asked Harold the question that mattered most. Does Daniel know? Harold shook his head. Thomas specifically requested minimal disclosure, unless circumstances required it. He worried money would complicate Daniel's relationship with the Beaumont family. My chest tightened painfully hearing that because suddenly Tom's quiet resentment toward his wealthy relatives made perfect sense. He understood exactly how families like the Beaumonts operated when status and property became involved. Harold leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. There's another issue. My stomach tightened again immediately. What issue? He opened another folder, revealing updated contract drafts from the Vineyard's board. Patricia and Charles plan to shift portions of future wedding expansion rights into Vanessa's marriage trust after tonight. I stared at him. Without telling Daniel? Harold nodded slowly. Or you. Silence settled heavily around us, while kitchen staff continued working nearby, completely unaware the entire ownership structure beneath Beaumont Ridge Vineyard was quietly unraveling beside the catering station. They assumed nobody would notice, I asked finally. Harold actually laughed under his breath. Wealthy people become careless when they spend too long surrounded by agreement. At that exact moment, the ballroom erupted into applause, loud enough to shake the swinging kitchen doors slightly. Harold glanced toward the sound before looking back at me carefully. The family acknowledgement speech is beginning, he said. I frowned slightly. What's that? Harold's expression darkened faintly. Patricia apparently planned a public presentation welcoming Daniel officially into the Beaumont legacy. Something cold moved through me immediately, because suddenly I understood. This was never simply a wedding to Patricia Beaumont. It was an acquisition. And she fully expected my son to stand smiling beneath chandeliers while she publicly erased where he came from. What Patricia still didn't know was that Harold Whitmore carried one final document inside that leather briefcase. A document requiring formal acknowledgement of ceremonial property ownership before any future licensing agreements connected to Beaumont Ridge could legally proceed. And according to Vineyard contract law, that acknowledgement had to happen publicly in front of witnesses before the reception ended, including the name of the owner. The ballroom looked even more beautiful when I walked back inside, beside Harold Whitmore 20 minutes later. Maybe humiliation sharpens your vision afterward. Every chandelier glowed warmer somehow. Every polished wine glass reflected soft gold light across white linen tables covered in imported roses Patricia Beaumont probably spent months selecting. A jazz pianist played quietly near the dance floor, while waiters moved between guests refilling champagne with rehearsed elegance. Wealth creates atmosphere expertly. That's one thing rich people understand better than most. They know how to build environments convincing enough to make power feel natural. The moment Patricia saw me re-enter beside Harold, I noticed the smallest flicker of confusion pass across her face. She recovered almost instantly, of course. Women like Patricia survive through performance. But confusion still arrived first. Evelyn, she said smoothly as we approached, I was just about to send someone looking for you. Such a polished lie. Patricia Beaumont had no intention of looking for me. People rarely search for what they already decided matters less. Harold shook Charles Beaumont's hand politely, while Patricia scanned the leather briefcase beneath his arm. Something about it clearly unsettled her. Old money families recognize legal paperwork the way animals recognize approaching storms. Charles smiled carefully. Harold, didn't expect to see you tonight. Harold returned the smile mildly. Business rarely schedules itself around weddings, unfortunately. That sentence meant nothing to most people nearby, but I watched Patricia stiffen almost imperceptibly. Daniel approached us then with Vanessa beside him. My son looked relieved the moment he saw me back inside the ballroom instead of isolated behind kitchen doors. Vanessa hugged me tightly without caring who watched. Good girl, I thought again. Still trying to love people honestly despite the environment that raised her. Then Patricia tapped her champagne glass gently for attention. The ballroom quieted almost immediately. There's something unsettling about wealthy people gathering silently on command. Years of privilege teach them attention follows money naturally. Patricia smiled toward the crowd with practiced grace. Before dancing begins again, she announced warmly, Charles and I wanted to say a few words welcoming everyone tonight. Guests turned politely toward the front platform near the dance floor while waiters paused service along the room edges. Daniel shifted beside Vanessa, looking deeply uncomfortable already. He knew his future mother-in-law well enough now to fear public speeches. Patricia continued gracefully. Family means legacy, tradition, shared values passed carefully between generations. She looked toward Daniel, then smiling almost maternally. Tonight, we are honored to officially welcome Daniel into the Beaumont family. Polite applause filled the room. I watched Daniel's face carefully during that moment. Not proud exactly. Uneasy because somewhere deep down, he already understood what Patricia truly meant by family, ownership, not sacrifice, not loyalty, certainly not struggle. Patricia motioned toward Charles, who lifted a crystal glass and began discussing the Beaumont family's history connected to Beaumont Ridge Vineyard. He spoke about expansion, heritage, social reputation, and future generations carrying the vineyard legacy forward. Every sentence sounded polished enough for magazine interviews. Then Charles said something that made Harold Whitmore straighten slightly beside me. Beaumont Ridge has remained under Beaumont stewardship for nearly 50 years now, Charles declared proudly, and our family intends to preserve that tradition for generations ahead. Harold quietly muttered, well, that's legally inaccurate. I almost smiled. Patricia then gestured toward a nearby server carrying a velvet presentation folder. As part of tonight's celebration, she announced, we've prepared preliminary documents welcoming Daniel and Vanessa into the future development structure of Beaumont Ridge Properties. The ballroom applauded again. Daniel looked completely blindsided. Vanessa, too. I saw her glance sharply toward her father in visible confusion. Neither of them knew. That realization hit me immediately like cold water. Patricia and Charles planned this privately, without discussing it honestly with the bride or groom. Harold leaned toward me slightly. That would be the unauthorized transfer draft. My stomach tightened. Can they do this? Harold smiled faintly. Not unless you suddenly stop existing. Meanwhile, Patricia continued speaking proudly at the front of the ballroom. Legacy matters because family matters, she declared elegantly. And tonight we celebrate not only marriage, but continuity. Then Harold Whitmore stepped forward. The timing was almost surgical. Actually, he said calmly, his older voice carrying far more authority than volume. Before any continuity documents are discussed publicly, state property acknowledgement requirements need to be clarified first. The entire ballroom went silent. Patricia blinked once. Excuse me? Harold adjusted his glasses and spoke with the slow precision of a man who spent 50 years dismantling wealthy people politely inside courtrooms. Missouri ceremonial land licensing law requires formal acknowledgement of all vested ownership parties before future operational transfer agreements may be introduced during contracted public events. Nobody in that ballroom understood half those words except Patricia and Charles, which was exactly why the color began draining from both their faces simultaneously. Charles stepped forward immediately. Harold, perhaps this conversation can happen privately. Harold shook his head mildly. Ordinarily, yes. However, because tonight's event itself falls under active ceremonial licensing jurisdiction connected to the South Vineyard grounds, legal acknowledgement must occur in front of witnessed attendees. The room had become so quiet you could hear silverware settling against plates. Daniel stared between everyone in growing confusion. What is happening? Harold turned toward him gently. Your late grandfather protected ownership contingencies connected to portions of this vineyard decades ago, Daniel. Patricia interrupted immediately, her polished composure finally cracking slightly. Harold, this is neither the time nor place. Actually, he interrupted softly, your wife selected both the time and place when she introduced unauthorized property transition materials tonight. Patricia went completely still after that. Then Harold opened his leather briefcase. I will never forget the sound those document clasps made inside that silent ballroom. Small sounds become enormous when power begins shifting unexpectedly. Harold removed several official property records before speaking clearly enough for every guest in the reception hall to hear. Under the amended Carter-Beaumont inheritance structure filed following Thomas Carter's death, 30% ceremonial ownership authority connected to Beaumont Ridge Vineyard currently belongs to Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Silence, Dobbesabolt silence, the kind so complete it physically changes the air inside a room. Across the ballroom, one wine glass slipped from somebody's hand and shattered quietly against hardwood floors. Patricia Beaumont looked at me like she was seeing a completely different human being for the first time. Not because I changed. Because suddenly my existence carried legal authority she respected more than dignity. That's the tragic thing about people obsessed with status. They only recognize humanity once power becomes attached to it visibly. Daniel looked stunned. Mom, what? Vanessa stared openly at her parents now with dawning horror spreading slowly across her face. Charles Beaumont's jaw tightened so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. Harold continued calmly. Therefore, any future licensing transfers involving ceremonial property usage require formal approval from Mrs. Carter directly. A murmur spread through the ballroom instantly, whispers, confusion, shock. And for the first time all night, Patricia Beaumont lost control of the room completely. She stepped toward Harold, quickly lowering her voice. This is inappropriate? Harold smiled politely. No, Patricia. Seating a property owner in the kitchen was inappropriate. This is simply documentation. I looked around the ballroom then at hundreds of expensive flowers, crystal glasses, designer dresses, polished social smiles, and wealthy guests suddenly pretending not to stare openly at the woman Patricia Beaumont I spent a year quietly humiliating. Funny how quickly rooms change once rich people realize the person they dismissed actually belongs there more than they do. Then Daniel walked toward me slowly through the center of the ballroom. My son's eyes looked glassy with emotion by the time he reached me. You knew? He whispered. I shook my head softly. Not until yesterday. For several seconds he simply stared at me before something inside him finally broke emotionally. Not embarrassment. Gratitude. Real deep, painful gratitude. Because suddenly he understood the truth. The woman Patricia Beaumont, treated like social charity, spent decades carrying quiet sacrifices powerful enough to protect him without ever demanding recognition for them. And now the entire ballroom knew it too. The ballroom never fully recovered after Harold Whitmore said my name publicly. You could feel it in the air immediately. Wealthy people are extremely comfortable around power when they believe they understand who possesses it. But the moment power appears somewhere unexpected, especially inside someone they already dismissed, panic spreads quickly beneath all the polished manners. Conversations dropped into whispers across the reception hall, while guests pretended to focus on champagne glasses and centerpiece flowers instead of staring directly at me. Patricia Beaumont remained frozen beside the presentation podium, with her social smile slowly collapsing around the edges. For the first time since I met her, she looked uncertain, truly uncertain. Not because she suddenly cared about my feelings, because control had slipped away from her publicly. And people like Patricia build their entire identity around controlling how rooms perceive them. Daniel stood beside me, still trying to process everything Harold revealed. Mom, he said quietly again, almost like the word itself meant something different now. Dad never told me any of this. I touched his arm gently. Your father wanted you to build your own life without carrying old family bitterness. Daniel looked across the ballroom toward Patricia and Charles with visible heartbreak settling across his face. I think he knew exactly what these people were capable of. Vanessa heard that sentence too. I watched tears fill her eyes immediately, because reality finally reached her completely in that moment. Not the polished Beaumont version of reality, the real one. The one where her parents spent months treating the woman who raised Daniel like social inconvenience, while secretly attempting to absorb legal ownership tied directly to her late husband's family. Charles Beaumont recovered faster than Patricia did naturally. Men like Charles spend their lives negotiating around uncomfortable truths financially. He approached Harold with controlled calmness while guests openly watched now. Perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere private, he said carefully. Harold closed his briefcase slowly. You had that opportunity before introducing unauthorized transfer documents during a public contractual event. Charles lowered his voice further. There's no reason to embarrass anyone tonight. I almost laughed hearing that. Embarrassment only became concerning once wealthy people experienced it themselves. Patricia finally stepped toward me directly. Evelyn, she began softly, I think there's been an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding seating arrangements earlier. There it was. Revision. People obsessed with appearances rewrite history almost instantly once consequences appear. I looked at her calmly. You sent me to eat beside industrial refrigerators while investors drank champagne in my husband's family vineyard. Patricia's face tightened slightly. That wasn't my intention. No, I answered gently. Your intention was much clearer than that. The silence afterward felt enormous because everyone nearby understood exactly what I meant. Vanessa suddenly spoke up then, her voice shaking. Mom, did you and Dad really plan those property transfers without telling us? Patricia turned immediately defensive. It was simply preliminary family structuring. Without asking Daniel? Vanessa pressed. Charles interrupted quickly. We were trying to protect the vineyard's future. Daniel looked at him with open disbelief now. By hiding legal agreements during my wedding reception? Charles opened his mouth again, but Daniel shook his head sharply. No, don't explain it like it's business strategy. You treated my mother like she didn't belong here while trying to quietly absorb what belonged to her family. That sentence spread through the ballroom harder than any legal document, because people understand betrayal emotionally long before they understand contracts. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely after that. Your mother has manipulated this situation beautifully, she said coldly toward me. I stared at her for several seconds before answering, because honestly, I felt strangely calm now. No, Patricia, your own behavior did this. Her eyes hardened instantly. You enjoyed humiliating us publicly. That accusation almost fascinated me because people like Patricia truly cannot imagine accountability without assuming revenge motivates everyone else too. I spent an hour eating cold chicken in your kitchen while strangers celebrated my son's marriage 30 feet away, I replied quietly. And even then I protected your dignity more carefully than you protected mine. That ended the conversation, not dramatically, not loudly, just completely. Patricia looked away first. Funny how often power reveals itself through who breaks eye contact. The reception unraveled slowly after that. Guests resumed talking eventually, but the atmosphere changed permanently. People kept glancing toward me now with entirely different expressions. Some embarrassed, some curious. Some suddenly eager to introduce themselves politely to the woman they ignored earlier. Wealthy social circles shift loyalty fast once status changes direction publicly. A woman who seemed invisible during cocktail hour becomes fascinating after legal authority enters the room. I noticed something else too. The catering staff smiled at me differently afterward, especially the older waitress who brought my dinner earlier. She passed beside my table later and whispered quietly, "About time somebody humbled that woman." Working people always recognize justice faster because we spend more time surviving unfairness honestly. Around 9:30, Daniel pulled me aside near the vineyard terrace overlooking dark rows of grapevines beneath string lights. Cold autumn wind moved softly through the hills while distant music drifted from the ballroom behind us. My son looked emotionally exhausted. "I'm sorry," he whispered suddenly. "For all of it, I should stopped this months ago." I touched his face gently, exactly the way I did when he was little and scared after thunderstorms. Listen to me carefully. Loving someone should never require you to hate where you came from. Daniel's eyes filled immediately after that. I thought if I kept the peace long enough, everybody would eventually accept each other. I smiled sadly. Peace built on silence usually only protects the loudest people in the room. We stood together quietly for a moment, looking out across the vineyard Tom loved so much. Then Daniel laughed softly under his breath. Dad would have enjoyed tonight after all. I laughed too for the first time all evening. Only the ending. Vanessa joined us a few minutes later, wrapped in a white shawl with tears still lingering in her eyes. "I'm so ashamed," she admitted quietly. I took her hand gently. "You are not your parents' behavior." She cried harder after hearing that, because children carry enormous guilt once they finally recognize the flaws inside people who raised them. "I didn't see it clearly enough," she whispered. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders immediately. "Good man," I thought again. Still protecting people he loves even after disappointment. Then Vanessa surprised me. "If you want," she said carefully, "we can leave tonight, all of us. We don't have to stay here." I looked at that sweet, exhausted girl standing beneath vineyard lights in her wedding dress while embarrassment and loyalty fought visibly across her face. And suddenly I understood something important. This story was never really about Patricia Beaumont. It was about inheritance, not land, not money, character. The kind passed quietly between generations through sacrifice, dignity, and love. I squeezed Vanessa's hand gently. No, you stay. Dance with your husband. Enjoy your wedding. Don't let bitterness become the loudest memory attached to tonight. She hugged me immediately after that. Real hug, not social performance. Family, the actual kind. 3 months later, Harold finalized updated property agreements, transferring ceremonial rights fully into a trust jointly controlled by Daniel and Vanessa, under one condition I requested personally. A percentage of all annual vineyard wedding profits would fund scholarships for widowed women returning to school after financial hardship. Patricia hated the idea initially, naturally, but public embarrassment softened her considerably after wealthy St. Louis circles spent weeks quietly discussing how she seated a legal vineyard owner beside catering trays during her daughter's wedding reception. Reputation matters enormously to people who mistake status for identity. Charles eventually apologized privately over lunch one afternoon. Not emotional apology, businessman apology. Still, it mattered that he tried. Patricia never truly apologized at all, though she became noticeably quieter around me afterward. Some people never learn kindness fully. They only learn caution. Daniel and Vanessa remained married. Happily too. Real happiness. The kind built slowly through honesty instead of image management. They visit me every Sunday evening now for dinner at my farmhouse outside Monroe City. Vanessa helps cook. Daniel fixes things around the porch like his father used to. Ordinary life. Best kind there is. Last month, while cleaning old storage boxes in the garage, I found one of Tom's notebooks tucked behind rusted tools. Inside, near the back pages, he wrote something years ago I'd never seen before. If people make Evelyn feel small after I'm gone, they better pray she never realizes how strong she actually is. I sat there crying beside dusty paint cans for almost an hour after reading that, not because I missed the vineyard, not because Patricia Beaumont embarrassed me, but because the man I loved understood me better than I understood myself for most of my life. And maybe that's what dignity really is in the end. Not power, not money, not social status. Just finally seeing yourself clearly enough that nobody else gets to decide your worth anymore. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to She Finally Spoke and leave a comment sharing the moment you stopped shrinking yourself, just to make other people comfortable. Sometimes the quietest people carry the deepest strength. The world just notices too late.